We're here with Mike German, who's a fellow with the Brennan Center in New York and also a former special agent for the FBI who specialized in terrorism. We'll get into some of that stuff in a minute. Thank you so much for being on our website. Tell us a little bit about what you do now and some of the issues that you think deserve some attention from the public.
So at the Brennan Center for Justice, I work at the Liberty and National Security Program. So basically our focus is on ensuring that counterterrorism and national security programs first comply with the law and the Constitution, and also are effective and accountable. And that's really one of the most important elements from my perspective, having seen how the lack of accountability within agencies like the FBI that have very important missions can lead to problems where problems not being solved, and therefore they fester rather than get addressed. So,
how long were you with the FBI?
I was with the FBI for 16 years, from 1988 to 2004.
So you were there at the time the FBI's mission changed post 9/11 when it went to more of an interdiction philosophy.
So interestingly, I was always in an interdiction philosophy as an FBI agent. I did proactive law enforcement cases, working undercover in domestic terrorism cases. So while the rhetoric talked about how the FBI was changing its tradition to focus on interdiction, I had always been involved in proactive law enforcement as an undercover agent. So saw how that rhetoric wasn't actually addressing what the real problems were, number one, and number two was changing the approach in a way that I thought would be harmful both to civil liberties and to effective security.
Now, I'm going to digress for a second because you have a very interesting, extraordinary career. Back in, I believe, July 1993, if I remember correctly, the Fourth Reich skinhead case broke as national news, and you were the key person involved in cracking that case. Could you tell us a little bit about this extraordinary piece of criminal law history?
Sure. So I've been working here in Orange County, California, doing savings and loan fraud, and a fellow agent who had been trying to develop an undercover operation to target white supremacist groups that were engaged in a number of acts of violence in the Southern California area came to me and said, "You have blonde hair and blue eyes and youthful appearance. You could be."
And you still do.
You can work undercover as a neo-Nazi, and going from working the Lincoln savings and loan case, the biggest savings and loan failure in the United States, to the next day going undercover neo-Nazis was quite a transition. But I found the work very interesting and spent about the next 14 months undercover in local neo-Nazi groups and somewhat traveled all over the country with them.
Yeah, how do you make entree with these folks? And this is kind of pre-internet to a certain extent.
Yes, it was, but interestingly enough,
bulletin boards and stuff.
Right, and interestingly enough, I first heard of the internet and this strange concept of email from these white supremacist groups. And of course, I was in the FBI that is technophobic in many ways. I didn't have a computer on my desk until the late 90s. So they were early adopters of new technology, like any covert organization or entity does. They have to find new ways of communicating to try to stay a step ahead of law enforcement.
And these people were pretty bad folks. They wanted to machine gun the First AME Church, kill Rodney King, and cause a race war. I mean, this was gutsy stuff that you were doing.
Yes, and there were a number of different groups. The white supremacist groups break down into cells, and the different cells work independently of one another. So we were fortunate, and one of the ways we worked was through informants. So we had informants who could introduce me as somebody who they knew and trusted, and therefore vouch for me.
So did you make entree through informants?
Made entree somewhat through informants, and then once I was established in one group, it was easy to then move on to the next group. Or not easy, but it was possible for me to develop my own networks and to work. But working with informants is very important. You know, the FBI has a number of tools in the toolbox, and just because we're using the undercover technique doesn't mean the other ones aren't in use as well. So there were any opportunity we had to develop the case further, we took. And eventually the case was not originally targeting any particular group. There were a number of individuals who we had information they were engaging in criminal activity, manufacturing weapons, basically manufacturing illegal machine guns, manufacturing explosive devices, silencers, other illegal weapons. So the initial part of the case, and it started in 1992, which was when the Rodney King riots took place here in the city. So the racial tensions were very high, and the white supremacist groups were trying to stockpile weapons, assuming there would be more unrest and that they would then take advantage of that to spark the race war. So the original part of the case was focused on illegal weapons trafficking. But by moving from one group to the next, we came upon this group that called itself the Fourth Reich Skins that had already done a handful of bombings. So that's
Not non-injury bombings to that point.
Luckily, they were not very good bombers, and while their devices worked, nobody was injured, knock wood. But we're obviously improving their game, and part of the reason they were interested in working with me is because, and we never really understood how they knew this, because the cells are supposed to be independent and not talk about what they're doing, but they seemed to recognize that we had access to the machine guns that other groups were selling to us. So, whether that had spread through the grapevine that we had access to the weapons, so they were coming to us.
Were you afraid?
There were certainly, anybody doing undercover work would be a fool not to be afraid and not to be very concerned about their safety. You're always outnumbered. With groups like this, they're always heavily armed. Certainly anybody manufacturing an explosive device is showing a ill regard for human life and safety. So it was extremely important for me to be on my toes all the time, and you had to be lucky and as well as good, and make sure that you weren't making mistakes. And this was through the Joint Terrorism Task Force, so we had surveillance, we had other agents working the streets.